introduce Nick McBride. Delighted to introduce Nick McBride of Pembroke College, Cambridge, to talk about the humanity of private law. And I was just joking a little bit with Nick that I'm reading a lot of McBride and Steele on great debates in jurisprudence in particular at the moment. And it's very exciting for me because it speaks and engages the students, but actually quite independently of the teaching, it stimulates and engages me. So I think that's a really remarkable achievement for an introductory text in jurisprudence to do that. So that's my recent readings of Nick, but Nick's going to talk about his other work on the humanity of private law. So over to you, Nick. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks so much to the NUS Centre for Legal Theory for inviting me to talk today, and for FINA for organising the logistics of this talk. I thought I'd talk today about my new book, The Humanity of Private Law, Part 2, which is concerned to evaluate the current state of private law. And in this book, I set up a fight between two very different conceptions of human flourishing. And I argue that the future of the West turns on the outcome of this fight. We'll do well if the young challenger beats the old champion, and very badly if the old champion prevails. Now, in this fight, the undisputed champion of the West is what I call the RP, the picture of human flourishing that is widely accepted by reflective people in the West, and which is received by them from the culture and institutions that surround them. So under this picture of human flourishing, you're doing well as a human being if you have a range of primary goods in your life, such as obviously life itself, knowledge, friendship, marriage, or whatever you want to call it, that you have a significant other in your life that you share your life with, some sort of degree of mastery of some skill or game, some game or job, practical reasonableness, and some sort of aesthetic appreciation or identification with the universe or nature, or whatever you want to call it. Those goods are very much taken from Finnis's work on human flourishing, his 7 basic goods of human flourishing. But in the first humanity book, I added a few to that list. Creativity, the ability to identify with the life that you're leading, having some passion project in your life that you really care about achieving, and living in a community where nobody's left out, which looks out for everybody in terms of trying to foster everybody's flourishing. So if you've got those primary goods in your life, you're flourishing as a human being according to the RP, yeah? But in order to have those primary goods, you've got to have a set of secondary goods in your life, yeah? You've got to have options about what sort of life you will lead. You need a decent place to live, a decent job, a decent environment. You need to be able to mix with other people without shame. You know, you don't hide yourself away, you don't feel ashamed of yourself. And you're not deceived either about the character of the other people who you mix with, who you deal with, yeah? So you need all of those secondary goods in your life, and to get hold of those secondary goods, you need access to tertiary goods, such as money, and a law of contract that allows you to make reliable deals with other people to improve your position and get closer to a flourishing lifestyle, yeah? And you also need not to feel anxiety about your enjoyment of the primary and secondary goods. Your life will be ruined and won't that count as flourishing if you're always worrying about losing these things, you know, instead of enjoying what you've got, yeah? And you not only have to have all of these things, but your friends have to have those as well, because it's in the nature of love that if somebody you love isn't flourishing, then you're not flourishing either. Their welfare is tied up with you, tied up with yours. So if your friends, the people you love, aren't doing so well, then you can't count yourself as doing so well either. So that's the RP, that's the received picture of human flourishing that dominates in the West and that we drink in with our mother's milk. It surrounds us, it's part of the culture. And in The Humanity of Private Law, Part 1, I argue that this vision of the good life provides the key to understanding the current shape of private law. As private law, I argue in its current shape, is designed to help us RP flourish, enjoy the kind of existence that the RP tells us is a flourishing existence. And it's this picture of human flourishing that I want to assault in the Humanity 2 book, and to replace with a very different model of human flourishing. So the RP is what I call a possessions model of human flourishing. It says that you're flourishing if you enjoy certain goods in your life. And in the Humanity 2 book, I advance a journey model of human flourishing, where whether you're flourishing or not doesn't depend on what you have in your life, but in what direction your life is going. Now, when I started writing the book, I thought I was the only one to endorse a journey model of human flourishing. But then via a book by Alistair McIntyre, Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, I discovered that writer C.L.R. James had beaten me to the punch, that in his book, Beyond a Boundary, he said, time would pass, old empires would fall, and new ones take their place. The relations of countries and relations of classes had to change before I discovered that it's not the quality of goods and utility which matter, but movement. Not where you are or what you have, but where you've come from, where you're going, and the rate at which you're getting there. And as McIntyre observes, this is a very unfamiliar vision of what human flourishing involves. He says that James's account of what he had learned has both some notably Aristotelian features and some features that put him very much at odds with Aristotle. It's not a Platonic, nor Stoic, nor Kantian, nor Benthamite, nor Hegelian account. And it puts all those rival accounts in question. So this diagram, which is in the book, illustrates the journey model at work, where A and B and C are flourishing. I hope you can see the cursors are moving about. So A and B and C are flourishing, despite their different circumstances and positions, simply because their lives are moving in the right direction to a yet unspecified good, G. While D and E are not, because their lives are moving away from G, and F isn't flourishing because their life is going nowhere. They're just going round in circles. There's no direction to their life. So what is G? I suggest in the book that G is leading a truthful life, and correspondingly that someone is flourishing as a human being if they're engaged in a quest to lead a truthful life, something which I call QTLing. And while this vision of what human flourishing is unfamiliar, it's not completely unknown to us. So for example, Bernard Williams in his last book on truth and truthfulness talks about the still powerful ideal that we should live without lies. And the idea that human flourishing consists in being engaged in a quest to lead a truthful life would have been happily endorsed by the French writer and political theorist Madame de Staël. So I've got a quote from her: "Search for the truth is the noblest occupation of man. Its publication is a duty." And it's this ideal that I'm trying to revive and bring back to consciousness in the Humanity 2 book. And if I had to sum up this ideal in just one word, it would be using the word witness. The human vocation is to seek to witness the truth in the double sense that that word witness has, both as meaning contemplating reality and also as meaning speaking the truth, telling other people about reality. Now, the notion and importance of truth is newly fashionable among writers who, in my view, see it as a cudgel with which they can bash the populists who did so well politically back in 2016. But what I mean by a quest to lead a truthful life is far deeper than a simple ambition to try to be honest and not lie to people. For me, a quest to lead a truthful life is an attempt to be more real, to achieve an ever closer connection with reality. And I spend some time in the book discussing what reality would have to be like if it were to be capable of allowing you to embark on a lifelong quest to achieve an ever deeper connection with reality. The vision of reality that enables that kind of quest is one that we glimpse in things such as the Hindu Upanishads, or Beethoven's Late String Quartets, or Van Gogh's paintings, or the films of Terrence Malick, or indeed any great art, yeah? But it's also reality that we glimpse in other people's faces, and in particular in their eyes, which is why people don't like looking at other people in their eyes. There's just too much reality there. It's discomforting. But it's even the resolutely anti-mystical philosopher Brian McGee had to concede, while science tells him that absolutely nothing comes out of another person's eyes, when he looks in someone's eyes, he's seeing something inside that person, the deeper reality that constitutes that person's being. So those are the two contenders in the fight over the nature of human flourishing that I'm trying to set up in this book. A possessions model of human flourishing in the form of the RP, and a journey model which contends that human flourishing consists in being engaged in a quest to lead a truthful life, or what I call QTLing for short. So how do we work out which vision is superior? Well, the way I tried to do it in the book is I measure each vision against 4 postulates about human flourishing, 4 propositions about human flourishing that I can't prove are correct, but I think that we have every reason to believe that they're true. So the first postulate of human flourishing is that human flourishing is not necessarily confined to a privileged elite, but is something that can be enjoyed by everyone, given a decent chance of achieving it under the right circumstances. So no one need be shut out of this vision of human flourishing. Everyone under the right circumstances can flourish. The second postulate is contrary to what Socrates thought. Human flourishing is something that can be impaired by events outside your control, yeah? In Martha Nussbaum's phrase, you know, goodness, human flourishing is fragile, yeah? I don't sign up to the view that nothing bad can happen to a good person, that, you know, whatever happens to you, you can't stop that flourishing if you're intent on doing that, yeah? There are things that can happen to you outside your control that just knock you for 6 in terms of your flourishing. The third postulate is that there's something important and special about human flourishing that allows us to say that it counts as a good wherever it exists. And this isn't true of everything's flourishing. So, for example, I don't regard the flourishing of crocodiles or alligators as a good in this sense, or the flourishing of mosquitoes, or flourishing of the coronavirus. But there's something special about human flourishing, that when it exists, it's an unqualified good. And the fourth postulate is that human flourishing flourishes. It's naturally resilient and self-sustaining. Individuals who are flourishing and societies that foster authentic human flourishing are able to keep themselves going because their flourishing enables them to cope well with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So those are the 4 postulates against which I think any vision of human flourishing can be measured, and those are the postulates against which I measure these 2 different visions of human flourishing. And when we test out our 2 different accounts of human flourishing against these postulates, I argue that the idea that human flourishing consists in QTLing satisfies all four postulates, while the idea that human flourishing consists in the RP fails the first and fourth postulates, and I leave it open whether it satisfies the third, but I doubt whether it does. So I can't go through all the arguments I make in the book in favor of this conclusion, but I observe that in relation to the first 2 postulates, that they set up a tightrope that any vision of human flourishing has to be able to traverse successfully. So if you adopt a very narrow, austere vision of human flourishing, you may satisfy the first postulate. You may be able to argue that, well, everyone can have this, everyone can enjoy this, yeah, because it's so narrow, because it's so austere. But you'll fall down when it comes to the second postulate. You'll find it very difficult to show on that narrow and austere vision how it's possible for a lot of external events to impact on someone's ability to flourish. But if, on the other hand, you adopt a very complex, ambitious vision of human flourishing, you'll be fine when it comes to the second postulate. You'll be fine with showing how all sorts of things can impair somebody's flourishing, all sorts of things that are outside somebody's control. But you'll fall foul of the first postulate. You won't be able to show that there's any conceivable world in which everyone could enjoy that very complex, ambitious vision of human flourishing. And that's where I think the RP falls down. It's so complex and ambitious, it's inevitable that not everyone can enjoy what I call an RP flourishing lifestyle. Even in modern Western liberal societies, which are most effective incubators of RP flourishing that have ever been known in the history of the world, significant proportions of the population don't enjoy a reasonable chance of RP flourishing. And that is actually what I think is the key explanation of the rise of populist parties in our time, because the penny has dropped with a lot of people that under the existing social order, they don't stand a chance of enjoying this vision of the good life, the RP, and they want change. They want fundamental, radical change to enable them to do that. But I'm very skeptical whether any such change can enable everyone to enjoy the RP. I think it's an impossibility. I cannot conceive of a world in which everyone enjoys more than a 50-50 chance of enjoying an RP flourishing lifestyle. By contrast, when it comes to walking the tightrope set up by the first two postulates, the idea that human flourishing consists in QTLing satisfies the first postulate. So one of the reviewers of the Humanity book observed to me that my ideal of human flourishing is very austere. But that's a good thing when it comes to the first postulate, because it means this kind of flourishing is within the grasp of any human being under relatively favorable circumstances. It isn't just something that can only ever be enjoyed by a certain class of human beings under any circumstances. But my ideal is not so austere that it fails the second postulate. There are events outside your control that can severely impinge on your ability to engage in a quest to lead a truthful life. So to demonstrate this, I introduced in the book the concept of an attention well, where person A sits in a relatively shallow attention well and is as a result able to engage with and connect with the reality around her. In contrast, person B is trapped in a deep attention well and can only engage and connect with whatever it is that has trapped them in that well, that has seized their attention, and as a result is unable to engage or connect with the reality beyond the well. As a result, A has far more capacity to engage in a quest to lead a truthful life than B has. In fact, B has none. And as we'll see, many things can plunge you down a deep attention well. But one such thing is pain, which drags your attention back onto yourself and doesn't let it go until it's dealt with. So consistent and long-lasting pain can severely impact on someone's ability to engage in a quest to lead a truthful life. And whether or not you end up suffering that kind of pain is something that's entirely outside your control. I also suggest that as a vision of human flourishing, the RP falls foul of the fourth postulate, while the idea that human flourishing consists in QTL flourishing does not. I argue that modern Western liberal societies don't seem to have what it takes to secure their continued existence into the long term, contrary to what we would expect if they were centered on an authentic vision of human flourishing. So in the book, I set out the facts on things like low birth rates and high suicide rates that tend to be a feature of modern Western liberal societies. But the last few months, since the Humanity 2 book was published, have given us a graphic and frightening demonstration of how fragile Western liberal societies are when faced with adversity. So a political and media elite, which has been very successful in achieving an RP flourishing lifestyle for themselves, have been persuaded by the threat of coronavirus out of fear of losing that lifestyle to adopt self-defeating Vietnam era, you have to destroy the village to save the village measures to deal with the coronavirus crisis. And the result is that, like Wile E. Coyote, we may have already gone over the edge of the cliff, and we're now operating, at least here in the UK, with no visible means of support. But if, like Wile E. Coyote, we're heading for a big smash, it will be our adoption of the RP which has done us in, completely contrary to what we would expect that vision of human flourishing were authentic. Now, of course, I'm very mindful that the Singapore government and people have coped much, much better with the COVID crisis than the UK has. But if COVID don't get you, then our attachment to the RP will rebound on us in some other way. For example, through declining fertility rates. So the fertility rate in Singapore, the average number of children a woman in Singapore can be expected to have is currently 1.14. which is below the figure of 2.1, which is needed for the population in a country to remain stable. And to show the huge difference that differing fertility rates have on population in the long run, I plugged some representative figures for Singapore into a population calculator and let it simulate population trends over 150 years. So the top slide shows what happens if your fertility rate is 2.1. There is some decline in population because the average age in Singapore is already 42, which is a little bit gray. But after 150 years, the decline isn't catastrophic and is leveling off. There is no more decline. Whereas as the bottom slide shows, if your fertility rate is 1.2, which is higher than it is in Singapore at the moment, the effects are catastrophic. The population approaches zero over 150 years. You'll have to read the book for the full vindication of my vision of human flourishing over the RP. But I'll turn now to another part of the book, which explores what difference it would make to private law if we were to accept that human flourishing consists in QTLing rather than the RP, and if private law sought to help enable us to lead a quest to lead a truthful life. And there are a number of differences I identify in the book. The first is that, surprisingly, a private law that was designed to foster QTLing would not place a high priority on prescribing the kind of frauds that we are most familiar with. When I tell lies to you to get you to act in a particular way. If I tell such lies to you, I damage my own ability to QTL flourish, but I don't necessarily damage yours. But what our new private law would be very concerned with is the kind of fraud known as gaslighting, where you inflict what Miranda Fricker calls an epistemic injustice on someone else by making them doubt their own capacity to grasp and understand the truth by questioning whether their vision of reality is really real and planting in their head the thought that they're actually going nuts, that they're going insane, yeah? Now, our current private law provides no remedy to the victim of such treatment unless their treatment actually does result in them developing a psychiatric illness. But no such limit would exist under our new private law, which would be very concerned to deal with this sort of behavior, regardless of whether it results in someone suffering a psychiatric illness. Our new private law would also place a much greater priority on protecting freedom of speech than private law currently does. At the moment, private law tends only to protect freedom of speech when someone's speech threatens their or another's enjoyment of one of the goods that constitutes RP flourishing. So private law might protect someone from losing their job for sending out an ill-advised tweet, but it does nothing, as Donald Trump has just discovered, for a person whose tweet is deleted by Twitter and their account is deleted because those who run Twitter would prefer that those kinds of tweets are not sent. Now, our new private law would value and protect freedom of speech of and in itself as an essential feature of QTL flourishing. And the Humanity 2 book spends some time discussing how it might do this by, for example, extending whistleblower protection to academics and journalists whose freedom of speech is undermined by their employers, and designating companies that provide online platforms for speech as engaged in a common calling, which means that people using those platforms cannot be kicked off them without good reason. The Humanity 2 book also discusses what our new private law would do about products that are explicitly designed, that have as their aim to plunge people into a deep attention well by grabbing their attention and making them addicted to the thing that is grabbing their attention. So in the book, I discuss the possibility that smartphones and apps which are designed to be addictive might be regarded as defective products. Now, under our current private law, that would be regarded as ridiculous. If a product doesn't threaten somebody's health, including their mental health or their property, then they won't be regarded as a defective product, and then no liability will attach to those. But a private law that valued our capacities for attention, that was worried about people being plunged into deep attention wells, would have a much more skeptical view of these kinds of products. Our new private law would also intervene to prevent us developing a false self-image by protecting us from being treated in ways that make us feel subhuman, by protecting us from being treated like an animal. In the book, I use the expression treated like a dog. So in the book, I discuss, first of all, how our new private law would deal with the situation where a public body simply ignores somebody who's in need. Yeah? At the moment, our new private law, at the moment, the current private law does not impose any general duty on public bodies to assist somebody who's in need, unless there's some special relationship or special circumstances that give rise to such a duty. But I explore in the book whether, in the case where a public body is completely indifferent and just leaves somebody unattended to when it's actually their job to do so, whether there might be some sort of claim in misfeasance in public office. But misfeasance in public office is a strange kind of action. It seems more concerned not with vindicating the rights of individuals, but vindicating the public interest in government power being used properly. And I suggest that our new private law would be find it much, much more straightforward to hold public bodies liable, not necessarily for failing to take care to see that somebody is okay, that somebody in need is helped, but for being completely indifferent to somebody suffering when it's the responsibility, the job of the public body to look after that person. I also discuss in the book what our new private law would do about people who are treated by private companies, yeah, in ways that make them feel that they're less than human, where they just run about all the time, you know, and just regarded as a pair of hands and a pair of legs rather than a real human being with real needs, yeah, including the need for time, the need to take time away from work to appreciate other things, and at the moment there's very little that private law does to, short of somebody's health being threatened, to protect somebody and protect somebody's time, and to protect somebody from being just run off their feet. Yeah. I suggest that in the book that a large part of the reason for the demands that private companies such as Amazon, place on their employees is the fear that managers have that they'll be fired if they don't hit certain targets, which causes them to make more and more demands of the people below them. So I consider in the book whether under our new private law, then we might have a rule which says that a manager cannot be fired for failing to meet the target, which might decrease a lot of the pressure that managers feel the need to place on their employers to make sure that they hit their own targets. Another thing which undermines QTLing because it tends to lock you into a deep attention well, as well as causing you to identify your flourishing with another's being harmed or destroyed, is hatred. And the Humanity 2 book explores what the etiology of hatred is, how justified anger at another can morph into hatred of that other, and what private law can do to protect someone from coming to hate somebody else. The argument is that such private law would be far more willing than it is currently to provide a remedy to a claimant where someone they love is killed or injured in outrageous circumstances. At the moment, such a claimant cannot sue unless they can show that they have developed psychiatric illness. But again, our new private law would see no reason to place such a limit on a claimant's right to sue, and would instead seek to provide the claimant with a remedy that would be effective to prevent the claimant's justified anger with the defendant for robbing them of somebody they cared about, morphing into hatred. And the Humanity 2 book also discussed how someone's being betrayed by another can impede their QTLing by damaging their future capacity to enter into intimate relationships with another and trapping them into endlessly revisiting their past with regrets about what might have been. So in the book, I discussed the Spy Who Loved Me cases, where the police infiltrated various environmental and anarchist activist groups and started sexual relationships with members of those groups so as to preserve their cover. So on the screen, you can see a photo of one such activist, Helen Steele, who's quite famous from the McDonald's litigation, Steele and Morris versus McDonald's. And she ended up having a relationship for, I think, about 3 years with someone who, unknown to her, was a police officer, John Dines. He said to her his name was John Barker. And then one day he just disappeared out of her life, and she had no idea what had happened. And what had actually happened was that John Dines' superiors had ordered him to move to another job, to move to another assignment. Yeah, so he just packed up, left, never contacted Helen Steele again. And she spent years searching for him, searching to find out what exactly had happened. The second photo is her actually confronting him in an Australian airport. So I think this is about 15 years after they broke up, to ask him why he did what he did and how he feels about what he did. Yeah, and she's confronting him because he was in Australia to give a course on police training. She was saying, "Are you really the most suitable person to do this, given the way you treated me?" And she and others who were treated in the same way sued. She complains that to establish their claims against the police, Steele and their fellow litigants were required to undergo psychological assessment. This, she says, felt like adding insult to injury. You couldn't just say this was upsetting and wasted this many years of my life, Steele explains. You had to demonstrate in order to sue either financial loss or a diagnosable psychological injury. If you've lost the opportunity to have children or the opportunity to form loving relationships, that's not counted as a loss because you can't put a value on it. So our new private law would not be so constrained, but would afford those whose betrayal has damaged their ability to trust people in future some sort of symbolic remedy to make it clear that their treatment was unacceptable. And where their betrayal has left them with regrets about the way their life has gone and the chances they've missed, a remedy that's substantial enough to enable them to move on and reconcile themselves with the way things have gone. And the final chapter of the book, I discuss whether private law should be reoriented away from promoting RP flourishing and seek to promote QTL flourishing instead. And to consider this issue, I set out 6 formulae that the courts might follow in developing private law. And I argue, out of these 6 formulae, I argue in favor of their following the first formula, that the court should develop private law in whatever way would make things go best. So they shouldn't say, well, we'll only develop it in a way that might things go best if the majority of the subjects would support us doing this, but only if making things go best wouldn't violate anyone's rights, or only if it'd be compatible with people being treated with equal concern and respect, or only if it's an incremental change, or a completely different ideal that the court should develop private law if doing so would enhance the protection private law gives to its subjects' rights. So I argue in favor of the first proposition, but I also go on to argue that in the absence of a significant majority taking the view that their flourishing consists in QTL flourishing, steering private law away from promoting RP flourishing and towards promoting this quite different ideal of human flourishing would not make things go best. Now, this isn't just because using private law to promote a vision of human flourishing that's not endorsed by the majority of its subjects would damage the legitimacy of private law and thus its effectiveness in the eyes of its subjects. But it's also because flourishing is like eating, sleeping, and reading. It's something you have to do yourself. Nobody can do it for you. And if you identify your flourishing with the RP, enabling you to lead a QTL flourishing life is pointless. You simply won't take the path that the law enables you to go down, but will instead continue along the path of attempting to lead an RP flourishing life. So it follows that the reorientation of private law set out in the Humanity 2 book must await a more general reorientation among private law subjects, away from identifying their flourishing with the RP and towards thinking that human flourishing consists, as I argue it does, in engaging in a quest to lead a truthful life. By way of a conclusion, I'd like to go back to the start of the book, which began by quoting Anne Glyn Jones' bleak verdict in her 1989 book, Holding Up a Mirror, that we live in a civilization which has run its course, which is morally, aesthetically, and spiritually bankrupt. I'm more hopeful. I think as a civilization, we still have a chance. As I say in the preface to the book, if we're to avoid proving Glyn Jones right, the need for us to think again as to what it means to live a good life is urgent. And our only hope of being part of the first civilization in history that took itself to the precipice of ruin and turned back rather than throwing itself over the edge. This book will have achieved its purpose if it improves the odds of our undergoing such a revolution in the head, as well as providing readers a glimpse of what English private law might look like in the future, should we find our way out of the dark woods in which we have lost ourselves. And I wrote that in July 2019 when I went to the Gladstone Library in Wales, currently closed, to try to get the book finished. At the time I wrote that, I thought what I'd written was far too dark for anyone to be able to accept it. But I hope that given what's happened over the last year or year and a half, more people will be willing to listen to the basic message of this book, and we need to rethink our basic ideas as to what a good life consists in, as I would claim our current ideas have taken us to some very dark places. So that's all I had to say. So I'll stop the share. Pinner, you can stop the recording, I think.